Jacob resumed his journey, and he went to the eastern country. He looked and saw a well in a field. Three flocks of sheep were lying there beside it because the sheep were watered from this well, but a large stone covered the opening of the well. The shepherds would roll the stone from the opening of the well and water the sheep when all the flocks were gathered there. Then they would return the stone to its place over the well's opening. Jacob asked the men at the well, "My brothers, where are you from?" We're from Haran," they answered. "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" Jacob asked them. They answered, "We do know him." "Is he well?" Jacob asked. "Yes," they said. "And here is his daughter Rachel coming with his sheep." And Jacob said, "Look, it is still broad daylight. It's not time for the animals to be gathered. Water the flock, then go out and let them graze." But they replied, "We can't until all the flocks have been gathered and the stone is rolled from the well's opening. Then we will water the sheep." While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. As soon as Jacob saw his uncle Laban's daughter Rachel with his sheep, he went up and rolled the stone from the opening and watered his uncle Laban's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept loudly. He told Rachel that he was her father's relative, Rebekah's son. She ran and told her father. When Laban heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, he ran to meet him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then he took him to his house, and Jacob told him all that had happened. Laban said to him, "Yes, you are my own flesh and blood." This is the word of the Lord.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Many of you probably know these words. They are familiar words that were penned around 1773 by a man named John Newton. John Newton's story was a winding one. From what we know, he appeared to have come to faith sometime around the age of 23. But if you follow his life, you'll see that there was a lot of sanctification left on his journey. Over the next few years, it's kind of all he knew, but he became a captain of a slave ship where he participated in and witnessed the many horrors of the slave trade. Eventually, at 29, he had to resign from that because of some medical issues, and he eventually attributed the grace of God in that journey, and he later would become a pastor, and he would say this about his involvement with the slave trade. He said, "I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders." At the age of 51, he would write the hymn Amazing Grace. It was meant to be a complement to a New Year's Day sermon, and so he introduced it to his congregation. And later he would publicly renounce and speak against the slave trade that he once took part in. I don't know what I'm getting, but I think it's probably my mic placement. Sorry about that. The same surprising grace that broke into John Newton's life and saved him also worked to sustain and sanctify him throughout his life. And it's this same surprising grace that we're going to see in our text today through Genesis chapter 29. The song of the Christian truly is nothing other than amazing grace. So as always, church, it is a joy to be with each of you this morning. I'm going to try to fix this real quick. If I've not had the privilege to meet you, my name is Joel. I get to serve alongside our other elders as the pastor for preaching and oversight. And so as always, it's just a joy to be a part of the work that God is doing today in our body. We're continuing through the book of Genesis, and we've been spending a lot of time in the life of Jacob, as you can see. Today, we're going to cover all of chapter 29. You kind of heard the first third or so of it read to kind of introduce our narrative. By way of quick review, you might remember that Jacob had a rocky start to his life. He just barely missed out on being the firstborn, which in this culture was a really big deal. But then kind of partnering with his mom, he swindled and deceived his way into getting the earthly birthright and blessing of the firstborn. But as we saw last week in chapter 28, God had bigger plans and a bigger blessing to give that was given by grace alone, not by earning. And that was the Abrahamic blessing, that through Jacob, he would continue this promise that all nations would be blessed through him. And also in last week, we saw that that was confirmed, not only given by Isaac, his father, but confirmed by God himself while Isaac is asleep in a dream. So if you think he's earning anything, he's not. It's given to him by grace alone. The earthly blessing and birthright that he swindled and deceived for that paled in comparison to what God was going to give. And so in spite of Jacob's deceit and in spite of his failures, God still meets him on his journey of running. And this is where we find our first of three main truths that we're going to see today about God's grace. The first one is this: God gives sustaining grace for the fleeing. God gives sustaining grace for the fleeing. You might remember the story. He stole the earthly blessing from his brother Esau. Esau gets very angry and he says, once our father passes, I'm going to kill Jacob. And so his mom sends him off to flee to some relatives in the eastern country. Two reasons he's coming here to the eastern country. One, he's fleeing Esau. That's the main reason. The second reason is he's to find a wife from her people instead of from those who did not know Yahweh. And so he and his mom's attempts to work out God's promises on their own terms, through their own ways, it's led to disaster and division. And so he's just fleeing the mess that he's created. He's just running. But even though he's trying to run, God has still not left him. And we see this evident all throughout verses 1 through 13. You just heard them read. What's interesting is you don't see God explicitly mentioned at all, but it's clear that he is at work, even subtly in the background, sustaining Jacob, even when Jacob doesn't acknowledge it. He finds this well in the midst of a field, in the midst of a desert. And then there we see this meeting orchestrated between Jacob and his future wife. The idea of wells so far in Genesis has signified provision. It will draw to your mind that there is the potential of a romantic encounter. So in this culture, it seems like wells were the place you go if you were looking for a spouse. This might remind you of chapter 24, you might remember. Abraham's servant met Jacob's father, Isaac's wife, Rebecca. I know it's like one of these days we should have this like family tree so you can follow all this. But that happened at a field as well. So Abraham sent his servant to this well. And so Jacob is here in a similar boat, meeting his spouse at the well, though there are some definite differences. In that passage, the servant gave credit to God and acknowledged God throughout the whole thing. Here, Jacob just kind of shows up. He has no servant to send to do his work for him. He has no great wealth with him to give as a gift to the bride's family. He's a sojourner on the run, but God still graciously sustains him. He runs into these men here who know his uncle Laban. This would be, we met him in chapter 24. This is his mom, Rebecca's brother, okay? And so he asks, do you know Laban? Yes. Is he well? Is he at shalom is the actual word there. Is he at peace? Remember, Jacob's heading out to the eastern country, which so far in the narrative has signified moving away from the presence of God, but we still hear the yearning in his heart for shalom or peace. It's as if he's looking and longing for some type of Eden, even if he doesn't know it. Surely there has to be rest from the division that I've caused. Surely there has to be a place of shalom. Surely there has to be a place that I can stop running and just be at home. And the men answer in the affirmative. Laban is at peace. He is well. He's doing okay. And in fact, if you look out there, there's Laban's daughter, Rachel. You can see her out there in the distance. She's heading towards us. She's this shepherdess in charge of these flocks. And so far out in the distance, she's coming their way. Jacob, probably because he wants to interact with Rachel alone, because he doesn't know how it's going to go. But he wants them to leave, so he tries to get them to water the sheep real quick and leave. She's probably a long way off. They won't. There's cultural customs. Hey, we don't do this till everybody's together. But in front of them, he still kind of shows off to Rachel. He takes this big, large stone that the text tells us is there, and he moves it off of the well himself. And there's this inversion of the chapter 24 story, where there the woman fed the flocks of the male servant. Here, the man feeds the flocks of the woman, the shepherdess, Rachel. And so there is this greeting there where Jacob kisses her. This wouldn't have been a romantic kiss. This would have just been a greeting. But there's also this overwhelming flood of emotions. He's traveled for at least a couple weeks since his encounter with God at Bethel. And we're told he weeps loudly. There's some kind of relief in his heart here. Rachel runs ahead to tell her father Laban about it, and then Jacob gets there, and Laban runs out to Jacob. He embraces him, we're told, and he kisses him as well. He welcomes him in, And then we're told that Jacob narrates all that had to happen for him to be there. He tells them the events that brought him to their house. And so throughout all of this, even though Jacob has gotten himself into the mess, even though Jacob's own actions have caused him to head out to the eastern country, God still has not left him. God has offered sustaining grace for the fleeing Jacob, who's just trying to run from his problems. Jacob has met who will become his future wife. He has been welcomed into a home that was not his. And even though it's not perfect, as we'll see, it is a picture of God's grace. Jacob cannot outrun the grace of God, and neither can you. So Jacob, he's searching for shalom, some temporary Eden, so to speak. And momentarily, he has a sense of relief. You see it when he just weeps loudly. He thinks he might have found it. At least he's got a roof over his head, a potential place to settle down away from his angry brother Esau, away from this earthly conflict. But if we're listening closely and we keep reading, we'll see that all is not necessarily well. Look at verse 14 with me again. This is how Laban responds when Jacob tells him everything that had happened. Laban says to him, "Yes, you are my own flesh and blood." Laban hears the story of Jacob's deceit and his swindling of Esau, and his response is, "Yep, you are my own flesh and blood." This isn't him simply saying that they're relatives. It's him saying that they're cut from the same cloth, so to speak. They see the world in the same way, this kind of world where you posture and manipulate to get what's yours. If this were a movie, the camera would pan in closely to Laban's face as he makes this comment. The mood might darken a little bit and you might hear a little bit of suspenseful music begin. Things aren't shalom. And just like Jacob can't outrun God, neither can he outrun his sin. It will catch up to him. The thing is, he can't just fix it. He needs something outside of himself, someone greater than himself to deal with the mess that he made. He made it. He can't just patch it up and make it okay. And this is where we see our second main truth about God's grace. We saw that he gives sustaining grace for the fleeing, and here we see that God gives sanctifying grace for the failing. God gives sanctifying grace for the failing. In God's mercy, he causes Jacob to come face to face with his own failures so that he might sanctify him through it. This is a gracious thing. God wants to bring Jacob to a point where he helps him understand the harm that he's caused, that following his own desires and his own paths has actually hurt those around him. And one of the ways this happens in our life is when we're on the receiving end of it. I mean, if I often ask my kids this, like, how would it feel if someone hit you, right? Like, how would it feel if someone responded to you this way? And sometimes they're able to put themselves in the shoes of that and humble themselves and say, yeah, I wouldn't like that. And they begin to see something. Here, Jacob gets an object lesson in this. The narrative is written intentionally, so you see that now Laban is the one deceiving Jacob, the one who appears gracious and kind toward Jacob in the beginning. He's eventually going to deceive him. Even as he runs toward Jacob to embrace him and welcome him, like, let's remember the context. What was the last time that happened when somebody came from Abraham's family and relatives to Laban? Laban got a bunch of gifts and wealth in exchange for his sister. He was more than happy. Send her off. I'll take the wealth. We're good. Hey, another person coming. That worked out well last time. I cashed in. Let's go again. And so here come Rebekah's son, Jacob. Laban, again, is probably hoping for a quick exchange of a wife for some wealth. Jacob has nothing to give. He's fleeing all alone. So what it sounds like happened is Laban just puts him to work. And so he's there working for about a month. And about after a month of this, Laban asked him for a more permanent arrangement. They got to figure out the long-term plans for this. Maybe you've let somebody stay with you for a little bit, help them out. And after a while, you're like, hey, we got to figure this out. Like, you're eating some groceries. Like, we paying rent here? What's going on? Like, it's been good for a month, but let's figure out this long-term arrangement, okay? And so they got to figure it out. Look at Genesis 29, 15 through 18. Laban says to him, just because you're my relative, should you work for me for nothing? Hey, you're putting in work. Tell me what your wages should be. Let's make this fair. is what we see and appear. And then verse 16, now Laban had 2 daughters. The older was named Leah, and the younger was named Rachel. Older, younger. That's been in the narrative. It should trigger your mind to think about it. Leah had tender eyes, but Rachel was shapely and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel, so he answered Laban, I'll work for you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. So the narrator gives us some important info about Laban's daughters that we need to know. And then we also get to hear Jacob's desire. It's interesting. Jacob still seems to be operating with this lens of earning and transactional relationships. You might remember Abraham's servant came, was up front. I'm here for a wife, for my master's daughter. This is what we want. If it's God's work, it's going to happen. You might remember him saying that. He's put it in God's hands. Here, Jacob's been here a month, hasn't said a thing. We get to hear some of his desires in the background. But now he finally gets a chance to say, okay, we'll just have this transactional relationship. You give me something, I'll give you something. That's how it works. And so he asked for Rachel's hand in marriage. Yes, it's his cousin. No, it wasn't weird in this culture. I know it's weird in ours, or it should be. That's a bad joke. I shouldn't make fun of Alabama but early on in the biblical narrative, not a weird thing, and not just in the ancient Near East in general. It wasn't weird. But what happens is in this exchange, Jacob doesn't have money, so he says, hey, 7 years of labor, right? So about 4 years of labor would have been normal for a bridal price, so he goes above and beyond. He wants this younger sister over the older. Leah is described as being tender or weak-eyed. And we don't know exactly what that meant. There's different views, but it's clearly meant to be a contrast to Rachel, who possesses a recognized earthly beauty in this culture. We're told she has a beautiful or shapely form. That doesn't necessarily mean her physical form. It could be, but just her general presence. There's something from an earthly standpoint. She is an attractive person, and definitely more so than Leah. And this is appealing to Jacob. And we're going to see this pattern in Genesis of the way people see the world, either from an earthly perspective or a heavenly perspective. And here, Jacob, remember, he's just got a glimpse into the heavenly realm a few weeks ago. But he's being back to being led by only what his earthly eyes can see. And we won't read all of them. I'm going to kind of summarize them, but verses 19 through 30 kind of tells what follows. Laban agrees to the arrangement, and after 7 years, Jacob says, hey, I've worked, and he asks for his wife. There's this irony because he's told that we're told that the 7 years feels like only a few days. It's the exact same language that when he was fleeing, his mom said, hey, just stay there a few days. So there's irony here. He's here already for 7 years, but he's worked for her. He's earned the right to marriage, and so he demands it. Give me my wife. They throw this week-long wedding feast, would have been normal in this culture, and the idea that on the first night, Jacob was to go in with Rachel to consummate the marriage. But the narrator tells us that instead of giving Rachel in marriage, Laban gives Leah, and he wakes up the next morning after consummating the marriage, and instead of Rachel lying next to him in bed, there is Leah. So now Laban had deceived him. And you might say, how could that be? It culturally, very easy to happen. Most likely Jacob was at least mildly inebriated the night before. It would have been dark. The bride would have worn a veil all the way up to the bedroom. And so Jacob had no idea. The story is also very intentionally placing Jacob in the same role as his father Isaac a couple chapters before, when Jacob had also deceived him. The roles have been reversed. The trickster has been tricked. The player has been played. But there's more going on than just a reversal of the roles. That's a part of it. But by God's sanctifying grace, Jacob is getting a glimpse at the futility of trying to work things out in one's own strength. You might remember when he had tricked his father, he was trying to earn the blessing, usurping his brother, the firstborn's rightful role. And here he is trying to do the same with Rachel, putting her over Leah. Through Laban's words, conviction would have set in. Look at what Laban tells Jacob in verse 26. Jacob asks incredulously, what have you done and why have you deceived me? Same word as him deceiving his father. And here Laban answers, it is not the custom in our country to give the younger daughter in marriage before the firstborn. The literal wording there doesn't even include the in marriage. That's an addition based on the cultural context, and it's right. But the literal wording here is, it is not done in our place to set the younger before the firstborn. We don't do that here, Jacob. You might do that in your place. That might be the way you operate, but not here. We don't operate that way. Now, this is not giving an opinion on whether or not Jacob or Laban are upright in their decisions and who's better and who's not. There's a bunch of deceit going on all around. But it is showing us that trying and attempting to work out your interpretation of God's promises in your own strength and through your own deception and manipulation, it never ends well. It is a mess all around. And Jacob seems to understand, at least for a moment, because he gives zero defense for it. He is silenced. But he still wants Rachel. And so Laban agrees to give him Rachel in marriage as well at the end of the week-long feast. I was always taught he got her after the 14 years. It's actually, if you read it, he got Leah after the 7 years. There's a week-long feast, and then he gets Rachel at the end of that, but he's got to work for her another 7 years. So he got Leah on debit, Rachel on credit, and that's the way it worked out. So here he is, right? He's in this foreign land. He's got 2 wives. He's still got 7 years of work he's got to do, trying to earn what he desires. He's been swindled, but God is still working to sanctify him the whole time. If you need evidence that God's sanctifying grace is enough for you, go read the life of Jacob. God will complete the work he started. In spite of Jacob's deceit and frustrations and fleeing, God will do his work. And we get a glimpse of that here. We have still quite a few chapters left until we see the end of his life, but I'm telling you, it's beautiful. Jacob's life begins with the kiss of deceit to his father and ends with the kiss of grace from his long-lost son, Joseph. It's beautiful. But here he is in the mess. He has 2 wives, again, culturally acceptable in the ancient Near East, but was never God's plan. As we'll see, it always causes issues. For Jacob, specifically here, the favoritism that his parents had taught him continues on in his relationships with his wives. Look at verse 30. Jacob slept with Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. So you have this story of 2 men posturing and conniving and striving. You're going to see it continue, Laban and Jacob. Laban wants free labor. Jacob wants Rachel. And caught in the midst of their little battle and their tiffs is this tender-eyed, forgotten woman named Leah. And it's through her beautiful, shocking story that we learn the last truth about God's grace. God gives surprising grace for the forgotten. You have to feel for Leah. We don't know if she was a part of Laban's plan or just a pawn in his game. Even if she agreed to it, she probably didn't have much choice. Either way, the text is extremely intentional to highlight her story. I want you to look at verses 31 through 34 with me towards the end of our chapter. When the Lord saw that Leah was neglected, he opened her womb, but Rachel was unable to conceive. Leah conceived, gave birth to a son, and named him Reuben, for she said, "The Lord has seen my afflictions. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, gave birth to a son, and said, "The Lord heard that I'm still neglected and has given me this son also." So she named him Simeon. She conceived again, gave birth to a son, and said, "At last, finally, my husband will become attached or joined to me, united to me, because I have borne 3 sons for him." Therefore, he was named Levi. We're told that God saw that Leah was neglected. Literally, the word there is unloved, sometimes translated hated, the opposite of loved. Leah, this girl who paled in comparison in earthly beauty to her younger sister Rachel, who probably always lived in her shadow. This girl who no one else wanted. The girl who was always picked last at recess. The girl who sat alone in the lunchroom. The girl who always stayed in the background because she learned early on that her presence wasn't really valued and her voice wasn't really wanted. The girl who is no more than currency to her father and an unwanted consolation prize to her husband. This girl who thought that maybe marriage would give her what she always wanted, just a little bit of love and affection, but then quickly learned that marriage wouldn't fix anything. In fact, it only made it worse now. Now her unworthiness is on display every day as Jacob chooses Rachel over Leah again and again and again, just 1,000 little cuts every day. This neglected one, this unlovely one. But when no one else in the world noticed her, when no one else in the universe gave her value, when no one else saw her real beauty, God did. God's surprising grace reaches down into the lives of the forgotten, the unloved, the neglected, and his grace is lavished upon them. It is radical. It is crazy. From an earthly standpoint, it makes zero sense. Truly, it is amazing grace. And God gives her an amazing gift, which in this culture would have been incredibly significant. The gift of childbearing. She has 4 sons to start. It's interesting that with the birth of the first 3 sons, we see that she is still seeking validation and identity from her husband. The names that she gives them, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, that they're giving God credit for the gifts that they are, but ultimately she's still desiring validation, love, connection, union with her husband. Now my husband will love me. Now he will be joined or attached to me. She is still trying to earn love from another human, thinking that is what will satisfy her and make her whole. This transactional way of viewing relationships. You can hear the desires in her voice. Maybe I'll finally be enough. Yeah, I'm not as pretty in his eyes, and yeah, I was unwanted, but I'll give him kids and that will do the trick. But to no avail. And finally, after 3 disappointments, 3 times with all her hopes being dashed, she comes to the end of herself and she gives birth to a 4th son who is named Judah. And look at verse 35 with me. She conceived again, gave birth to a son and said, "This time I will praise the Lord." Full stop. Therefore she names him Judah. This name that means praise. No more trying to earn love from someone else. No more vying for her husband's attention and affection, at least in this moment. And she's going to struggle later. We're going to see it. But here in this moment, she will simply praise the Lord through years of suffering, just glimpses over it. But her praise came not from a place of just hearing a cute Christian cliche, but deep suffering and pain and grief. And so Leah gets a glimpse into it. But even then, she still has no idea the magnitude of what God was doing through her, and really everyone in this story. Jacob was after earthly beauty. Leah was after Jacob's attention and affection. And as we often see, their desires weren't too big, they were much too small. They were dreaming for some just temporary fix instead of something huge. Through Jacob, this deceiver, and through Leah, the unwanted and forgotten one, God's surprising grace breaks in and provides a son named Judah. At the end of his life, Jacob will prophesy over his sons, and look at what he tells Leah's son Judah. Genesis 49. The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belongs to him. He ties his donkey to a vine and the colt of his donkey to the choice vine. He washes his clothes in wine and his robes in the blood of grapes. See, Leah wanted affection from an earthly spouse, which is a fine desire to have. But God saw her neglected and unloved and used her to continue the line of the chosen seed that was promised all the way back in Genesis 3:15. No one else would pick her. No one on earth would say, that's the one I'm going to write my story through. But her son Judah would become the kingly line of the people of Israel. And her descendants would be the ones to bear this serpent crusher, the one through whom all nations, tribes, and tongues would be blessed. Jacob was looking for shalom and peace in all the wrong places and had no idea it would come through the bride he didn't even want as she bears the Prince of Peace, Judah, ultimately Jesus. And just as we see in this story, so we see in the prophets and the gospels that God's kingdom moves forward through the weak and the forgotten. Ezekiel 17 says this. This is what the Lord God says. I will take a sprig from the lofty top of the cedar and plant it. I will pluck a tender sprig from its topmost shoots, and I will plant it on a high towering mountain. I will plant it on Israel's high mountain so that it may bear branches, produce fruit, and become a majestic cedar. Birds of every kind will nest under it, taking shelter in the shade of its branches. Then all the trees of the field will know that I am the Lord. I bring down the tall tree and make the low tree tall. I cause the green tree to wither and make the withered tree thrive. I, the Lord, have spoken and I will do it. The word tender that's used to describe Leah's eyes is a difficult word to translate in that context. That's why commentators disagree about what it means. But one of the things we know, it's only used a few times in the Hebrew scriptures, and one of the few times is right here in Ezekiel. God is saying that he's taking this weak or tender sprig and that it will be raised up to become this tree through whom all would find peace or shalom. It's this new creation vision of birds just resting underneath it. Isaiah also prophesies of one who will come. And in his prophecy, it says that this one's going to come who will have no form or majesty. It's the same word that describes Rachel's beautiful appearance. And this tender sprig with no form is none other than the Messiah himself, Jesus the Christ. Leah, the forgotten, the unloved, points us to Jesus, who comes in the most unlikely way possible through a virgin girl who says herself, I am of low estate. I am a nobody. But I've been chosen to bear the Messiah. And he comes into the world unto his own, but you might remember he was rejected. His own did not receive him. He's despised, a man of sorrows who is deeply acquainted with the same grief that Leah had experienced over and over and over. Willingly entered into that, but with his life and in his ministry. You'll see it. He welcomes in all the Jacobs and the Leahs of the world. The failing, the unloved, the forgotten, and he lavishes grace upon them. He meets this woman at the well who looked for her identity in her relationships, who had been taken advantage of at times. He meets the woman with the issue of blood that made her an outcast. He even meets Nicodemus, this scared religious leader who can't even have the courage to come to him by day, but was growing tired of trying to earn his favor with God, not knowing how to move forward. Jesus meets them all where they're at with surprising grace, and he invites them to the table. And if we're still not convinced that God's kingdom moves forth in weakness, if we still want to make it about physical power and might and just getting what's yours, if we still don't think that God's kingdom moves forth through the unloved and the despised, then look to the old rugged cross, where as he's stripped naked and hanged up on this criminal's death, humiliating, where he bears the shame of all those who've ever sat alone in the lunchroom, where Jesus received in his body the brokenness and pain and division that humanity's deceit and striving and posturing had created. Just this mess where Jesus becomes one with the fleeing, the failing, and the forgotten. Willingly, and he takes it all on himself, and he becomes sin for us who knew no sin, so that we might be clothed with the righteousness of Christ. As undeserving and forgotten as we are, God sees. And in the resurrection, he moved a much larger stone than Jacob ever could. As the stone is rolled back and he secures victory over the powers of darkness and deceit, he wages war on sin and the enemy, and he takes his rightful place as the king. What he will come to be known as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who conquers by dying, who wins by losing, who gives us life through his death. And so through his work alone, Through his life, death, burial, and resurrection, what we call the gospel, he offers surprising grace to us. And the requirement is simply to give up, to stop striving and posturing and earning. And like, I'm convicted of, like, that's my life. It's like, if they get something good that takes away from me, that's how I want to see the world. But to just quit and simply receive his good gift of grace. And then we get everything that our souls long for. Everything Leah wanted, everything she desired, even the